And welcome back to the Word Encounter, episode 59. We're going to continue in 2 Samuel chapter 13. So it says in verse 1, as time passed, David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and David's son Amnon was infatuated with her. And so we see that Tamar is Absalom's full sister, but she is Amnon's half-sister. And so therefore they have different mothers. And so Amnon was infatuated with her. He wanted her, even though he was a sister. She was a sister. He wanted her. And so his cousin Jonadab comes along, and he's talking to Jonadab, and he's telling Jonadab, man, I really want this girl. And so Jonadab gives him a plan. And so he says to him, lie down on your bed and pretend you're sick. And so that's what Amnon does. And then in verse 6, it says, so Amnon lay down and pretended to be sick. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my presence so I can eat from her hand. And so he's pretending that he's sick, laying in bed. Summons the king. The king comes, says, son, what's wrong? I'm sick. Let my sister come make me some food. Okay. And it says, David sent word to Tamar at the palace, please go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare a meal for him. So he sends word to Tamar, go take care of your brother Amnon, he's sick. And so then she comes over, she starts kneading some dough and making some bread and stuff for him. And I guess there were servants, other people in the house. And so Amnon sends him away. And in verse 10, it says, he says this to Tamar, bring the meal to the bedroom so I can eat from your hand. And so that's what she does. She takes the cakes and she goes in. It says in verse 11, when she brought them to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, come sleep with me, my sister. Come sleep with me, my sister. That is some depraved stuff. And so she makes an appeal, don't, my brother, don't do this. This is not cool. We can't be doing this. Just tell the king he'll give me to you. Let's not do this way, is essentially what she was saying. But he refused to listen to her, and because he was stronger than she was, he disgraced her by raping her. So this dude raped his sister. And so in verse 15, so after he raped her, Amnon hated Tamar with such an intensity that the hatred he hated her with was greater than the love he had loved her with. Get out of here, he said. So this dude takes her, rapes her, forcibly rapes her, violently rapes her, and then he holds this against her, and then he hates her. Now I hate you. I did to you what I wanted to do you. Now I hate you. And we see this a lot in today's society with rapists. There's this underlying disdain for women, and they have this desire to do things. And then when they do them, it's like, get out of my presence. And that's not only with rapists too. There's a lot of guys operate on the same principle. Verse 16. No, she cried, sending me away is much worse than the great wrong you've already done to me. But he refused to listen to her. Instead, he called to the servant who waited on him, get this away from me. Here's the terminology, get this away from me. She's not even human anymore. Get this away from me. Throw her out and bolt the door behind her. Amnon's servant threw her out and bolted the door behind her. So now she's out in the street. She's been raped by her brother. She's been thrown out in the street. She's hated by him now. And then so she gets herself together and leaves. And she comes across her full brother Absalom. In verse 20, it says, her brother Absalom said to her, has your brother Amnon been with you? And so she tells him, yeah, she tells him what happened. And so in verse 21, when King David heard about all these things, he was furious. Absalom didn't say anything to Amnon, either good or bad, because he hated Amnon since he disgraced his sister Tamar. Verse 23, 2 years later, Absalom's sheep shearers were at Bel-Hazor near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. So this is 2 years later. Absalom is patient and he's conniving. We'll see more as we go along. So he sends for he's got some sheep shears, so he sends for his brothers, and he invites his father, come, I don't know what they're going to do, make some new clothes, or I'm not sure what they're going to do. But the king says, no, I can't go and whatnot. But in Absalom insists that Amnon comes. We see in verse 26, if not, Absalom said, please let my brother Amnon go with us. The king asked him, why should he go with you? But Absalom urged him, so he sent Amnon and all the king's sons. So he sent Amnon and all the king's sons went out to the sheep shearers. In verse 28, now Absalom commanded his young men, watch Amnon until he is in a good mood from the wine. So apparently there was a feast, they were drinking, eating, whatever. When I order you to strike Amnon, then kill him. And so Absalom's telling his young servants, this is what I want to do. Don't worry about it. I'm commanding you to do this. So it's not going to be on your head. It's on me. So Absalom's young men did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. And then all the other brothers, apparently they did it in the presence of the other brothers. They got up and they left. They fled because they didn't know, I guess, if they were going to be next. And so if we drop down to verse 37, after this happens, Absalom flees. It says, Absalom fled and went to Tamar, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. And so I'm not sure who David was mourning for, if he was mourning for Amnon or mourning for Absalom or mourning for both of them, but it says he was mourning every day. Verse 38, after Absalom had fled to Geshur and had been there 3 years, King David longed to go to Absalom, for David had finished grieving over Amnon's death. So I guess, yes, David was mourning for Amnon after Absalom had him killed and Absalom failed. And then it says after 3 years, now David was starting to miss Absalom because he was over grieving for Amnon. So we move on to chapter 14, and it says, Joab, son of Jeriah, realized that the king's mind was on Absalom. So Joab sent to Tekoa to bring a wise woman from there. So Tekoa was a city, and so Joab sent somebody to Tekoa to bring a wise woman from there. And so Joab is telling her he wants her to go before King David, and this is what he wants her to say. So he wants her to tell David this tale about how she's a widow and how she has 2 sons. And then they were out in the field. They got into a fight. One son killed the other son. And then all the family was outraged. And so they wanted to kill the son that killed the other son. But she's making an appeal to David. But he's the only son I have left. Please, don't let them kill him. And this and other. And so then David tells her essentially, no, this will not happen. His blood will not be shed. No, he shall not die. And so she keeps talking to him. And essentially she tells him, well, why would you do this for me and you won't do this for your own son? And so Joab put her up to this to get David to see that he should allow Absalom to come back home. And so then in verse 18, says the king answered the woman, I'm going to ask you something. Don't conceal it from me. And let my lord the king speak, the woman replied. In verse 19, the king asked, did Joab put you up to all this? And so when she was going through this tale and whatnot, obviously at some point, comes to David's mind that, wait a minute, this sounds like this is being manipulated by somebody who knows that this has to be Joab. And sure enough, it was. In verse 21, then the king said to Joab, I hereby grant this request. Go bring back the young man Absalom. And so David gives Joab permission to go and bring Absalom back. And that's exactly what Joab does. But King David has a condition. And in verse 24, it says, however, the king added, he may return to his house, but he may not see my face. So he can come back to Jerusalem, and he can go back to his house and nobody's going to harm him, but I won't see him. And so that was the condition. In verse 25, it says, no man in all Israel was as handsome and highly praised as Absalom. And so, obviously, he must have been a tall, erect, good-looking guy. And it says, from the sole of his foot to the top of his head, he did not have a single flaw. So this dude must have been something else, He didn't have a single flaw. And we see that, Absalom uses this stuff. as he goes through his treachery that we're going to get to. But he uses this stuff, and because he knows how people are, and we're no different. We like to follow people that are tall, erect, that have a commanding presence, booming voice, somebody that garners respect and whatnot. And none of this has anything to do with that person's character, but that's what we are attracted to as people. And so it says in verse 27, 3 sons were born to Absalom and a daughter named Tamar. So I'm thinking, I've always thought when I read this, that this was him kind of paying homage to his sister that got raped. I don't know if that's true or not, but, and it says he has a daughter named Tamar who was a beautiful woman. Absalom resided in Jerusalem 2 years, but never saw the king. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab was unwilling to come. And so he sent for Joab again, and Joab didn't come. And so apparently they were neighbors. They had fields that were together. I don't know if they were neighbors, but they had adjoining fields. And so Absalom commands his servants to put fire to Joab's field. And that's what they do. And that brings Joab out there. And Joab's like, what's going on, dude? And he says, well, you wouldn't come to me, when I requested you to come to me. So I burned your stuff. Essentially, that's what he said. And then he says in verse 32, look, Absalom explained to Joab, I sent for you. I sent for you to come and you didn't come. And then he says, why have I come back from Geshur? I'd be better off if I was still there. So now let me see the king. If I am guilty, let him kill me. And so, Absalom is now getting impatient. He's like, I can't see my dad. I can't see the king. Why am I here? In verse 33, Joab went to the king and told him. So David summoned Absalom, who came to the king and paid homage with his face to the ground before him. Then the king kissed Absalom. And so then they were reunited, father and son, and all seemed good on the surface. Again, on the surface. It says, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot, horses, and 50 men. And then what he did is he went to the city gate. Now, here's where he starts to really reveal how conniving he is. And so it says, whenever anyone had a grievance to bring before the king for settlement, Absalom called out to him and asked, what city are you from? If he replied, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel, Absalom said to him, look, your claims are good and right, but the king does not have anyone to listen to you. In other words, king don't have time for you. You have a good claim, but king don't have time for you. And then he added, if only someone would appoint me judge in the land, then anyone who had a grievance or dispute could come to me and I would make sure he received justice. In other words, if somebody put me in charge, all this would be taken care of. When a person approached to pay homage to him, so they know who Absalom is. He's the king's son. He's a prince. So when somebody came to Absalom and they were about to pay homage to him, apparently Absalom didn't let him do that because Absalom reached out his hand, took hold of him, and kissed him. It's like, no. Hey, brother, come here. So Absalom did this to all the Israelites who came to the king for settlement. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So Absalom was essentially seducing the men of Israel to follow his lead. This was part of his plan. Verse 7, when 4 years had passed, so see Absalom again, conniving and patient. Absalom said to the king, please let me go to Hebron to fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. So he tells him, I made a vow to the Lord, and I need to go back to fulfill it. And so David says, go in peace. Verse 10, then Absalom sent agents throughout the tribes of Israel with this message. When you hear the sound of the ram's horn, you are to say, Absalom has become king in Hebron. And so he's telling them he's going to Hebron because he has to fulfill a vow, but he's going there to proclaim himself king. And so he says, and remember, Hebron was the capital of Judah. And then after David became king over all Israel, he moved the capital to Jerusalem to be king over all of Israel. And so Absalom is going back to what was the capital of Judah and proclaiming himself king. And so it says that verse 12 that he was offering sacrifices, and then Absalom sent for David's advisor, Ahithophel. So Ahithophel was David's prized advisor. And so he's essentially now taking things that David has used in his wars and campaigns and reign, and he's now making them a part of his team, a part of his council. So Ahithophel is David's advisor, and he switches sides. And it says, so the conspiracy grew strong, and the people supporting Absalom continued to increase. And so now he's blowing up. He's getting big. And so, and it says in verse 13, that an informer came to David and reported, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And it says in verse 14, David said to all the servants with him in Jerusalem, get up, we have to flee, or we will not escape from Absalom. And so this doesn't sound like David, though, right? David has been a valiant warrior. He's been the one that has gone against the odds and this, that, and the other. And because somebody brings him a word, he's now going to move him and his whole household out of the capital and run from Absalom. But that's exactly what he does. And then in verse 15, it says, the king's servant said to the king, whatever my lord the king decides, whatever my lord the king decides, we are your servants. Then the king set out, and his entire household followed him, but he left behind 10 concubines to take care of the palace. We drop down to verse 24, and it says Zadok was also there, and all the Levites with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. So David, his whole household, and now the Levites, and so they're carrying things out of Jerusalem. They're going into hiding. They set the Ark of God down, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until the people had finished marching past. Then the king instructed Zadok, return the Ark of God to the city. If I find favor with the Lord, he will bring me back and allow me to see both it and its dwelling place. However, if he should say, I do not delight in you, then here I am. He can do with me whatever he pleases. And so David wants to David doesn't want the ark to go on the lamb with him. So he's sending the ark back to the city with the priests. And in verse 27, the king also said to priest Zadok, look, return to the city in peace and your 2 sons with you. I'll wait for you at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So he's sending them back essentially as spies. And when they hear something, come back out to the fords of the wilderness and let me know what's going on. We drop down to verse 32. It says, when David came to the summit where he used to worship God, Hushai was there to meet with him, his robe torn and dust on his head. So Hushai is coming, and he's got dust on his head and torn clothes, so he's in mourning as well. And verse 33, David said to him, if you go away with me, you'll be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and tell Absalom, I will be your servant, your majesty. Previously, I was your father's servant, but now I will be your servant. Then you can counteract Ahithophel's counsel for me. So he wants to send Hushai back, in order to get into good graces with Absalom, so he can counteract the advice of his former advisor. And so, it gets kind of deep. So with that, we're going to start, and we're going to pick this up tomorrow in chapter